Okay, wonderful. So good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everyone. And thank you all for joining us to this international workshop on facial recognition, AI challenges and solutions. I would like to first thank three deans, Dean Matthew Diller, Fordham Law School Dean, that enabled this activity and my course here. Dean Elad Finkelstein from Ono Law School, Israel, and Dean Nicholas from USTO. I also want to thank everyone who comes. Really, I'm really appreciate you taking your time from your full schedule and come to discuss and share some knowledge about facial recognition and especially about FRT, what we call facial recognition technology, among all the challenges around AI, artificial intelligence system. So I'm really thankful for everyone who helped me putting this program together and this event, and especially Professor Basri and Dror and from USTO and two organizations which are very close to my heart, Fordham Clip, where I'm the head of the AI and blockchain project, and Yale ISP, Yale Law School ISP, and of course my institute, Shalom, Comparative Legal Research Center, and Eliyau Center for Law and Technology. So recently, a report about facial recognition technology unveiled that RFT, which is initials for facial recognition technology, unveiled that it's being adopted recently by law enforcement across the globe, and especially in the US. US law enforcement agencies are increasingly use body-worn cameras, which challenge and might violate human rights and civil rights of the citizen, especially when paired with facial recognition technology. This is just one example of many uses of facial recognition among other uses that become so massive in our society of artificial intelligence in general. So in light of the rapid and constant growth in uses of AI, artificial intelligence on the one hand, and lack of regulation, especially in the US on the other hand, we are holding this online international workshop today to address the challenges and solutions. And Professor Carole Basri will address self-compliance guidelines as a proposed solution for this challenge that everyone is would love to have. Today we would like to discuss ethical and legal aspects of artificial intelligence system in general, and in particular, we would like to focus on the most sensitive system, the most controversial one, the one that we love to hate, facial recognition technology. The solution that Professor Basri will address is essential to tackle the ethical and legal challenges resulting from constantly changing of the ecosystem of AI, which now lacks proper regulation that we are all seek for, the policymaker as well as the industry. The current discourse on ethical and legal aspects of AI has intensified following a number of different US states banning specific uses of AI systems, such as, and even in New York, there is a draft, but there are many that already banned it, like San Francisco, we heard about recently, and others. And also, I think one proposal that really attracted attention, and we already had a conference about this proposal. I mean, the recent EU proposal that suggests outlawing certain uses of AI system. Therefore, I think the discourse of ethical and legal aspects of AI has become one of the most crucial public policy debates confronting the global economy. And I think it is our moment now, here and now, to shape the future of AI ethical and legal norms. Solution can be made only by, I think, by bridging, that's my point of view, solution can be made only by bridging the gap between policymakers and the industry. Therefore, we will also listen today to the voice of the most challenging AI industry FRT, and we invited the representative from this controversial technology, USTO, that that actually develop facial recognition technology. Our international workshop today on ethical vision, artificial intelligence, creating an ethical, effective AI compliance framework is part of a series of workshops in memory of Professor Joel Reidenberg, who is the founder and the head of the CLIP at Fordham Law, where I'm heading this project on AI and blockchain, who unfortunately passed away last year at the Corona time. As mentioned, we will host Professor Carole Basri, who is the chief advisor of the Association of Corporate In-House Counsel program, and who was the founder of the compliance program at Fordham University, and Mr. Dean Nicholas from USTO for discussion on the challenges and solutions, as mentioned, on ethical vision AI system. Surprisingly, we will see that in many aspects, they're on the same page, and the gap between the industry and policymakers can be bridged. Carole Basri, Professor Basri, will discuss the challenges of creating ethical and effective AI compliance framework as necessary solution for advancement and implementation of AI system in the global marketplace, on the one hand, and on the other hand, preventing malicious use of AI system. Learn the steps necessary to create corporate self-regulation with active government oversight as we enter the expanding areas of machine vision, biometrics, facial recognition technology, FRT, and more. The international workshop today is only the first step toward establishment of an incubator, of a forum for exchanging ideas, conducting research, and promoting discourse and publication. We envision an online forum that we are creating, and this is the first of its meeting, that once established will discuss, propose, and advance ethical and legal AI guidelines and principles for future regulation using academic tools such as research, roundtable, presentation, discussions, and publication. This forum is essential, as we say, to tackle these challenges nowadays resulting from this massive use of AI. Our goal is to fill the existing gap resulting from the lack of US laws and regulation relating to AI systems. It is also aimed to cultivate dialogue that is so lacking between policymakers and the industry by building bridges of trust between the two sides to create and foster better understanding of the different interests and promote and shape the goal of establishment of ethical legal principles, guidelines, and norms that both sides seek for, based on fairness, equality, privacy, responsibility, accountability, transparency, and accuracy of AI system. We would like to educate policymakers and the industry with innovative ideas, strategies, and guidelines that can be implemented by the industry from day one through the process. I already published a lot of articles in this issue. You can see privacy and equality by design, stating that from day one, the industry should adopt these legal norms, as well as the solution of having an entity to certify AI. And when I mean like that, everyone, all the role players, all the players in that I addresses in my model of multiplayer model should adapt and address these restrictions, these legal norms, these fairness, ethical, privacy, equality, and so on and so forth. So with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Carole Basri, and we would like to begin with the first presentation. What I like to say that Professor Basri will use 3 sets of presentation, and we will post all these presentations to you. And we are thankful again for all participants. And we'll take a moment to make sure that Carole Basri, Professor Basri, is with us and can join the discussion. Okay, so Professor Basri, the floor is yours.
Okay, so we're going to start with the basics of rolling out a corporate compliance program. This will then lead us into how you create an effective AI compliance framework. So could we turn to the first slide? Okay, so these are reasons to have a corporate compliance program. And they include an effective compliance program can insulate a company, its officers and employees from criminal and civil penalties, protect its board of directors from personal liability, and create what we call a culture of a good citizen corporation. And that's based on behavioral studies that show that 5% of people essentially are good. These were done by the FBI. 5% of people just like to do what they want to do. They're amoral, and 90% are followers. So if you can get a culture going to create a good citizen culture, a culture of ethics, you can push the good people and the 90% followers. And you'll never get rid of everyone that is capable of wrongdoing or unethical conduct, but you will be able to tap it down. And so I just wanted to bring this in. Also, we talk about an effective corporate compliance program. The word effective has a special meaning in compliance. Effective means not that it's reasonable or good or nice, but that it works, that it is effective for that company. And it is tailored to that company. So it's an effective corporate compliance program that you're always looking for. Next slide. Basic reasons for an effective corporate compliance program. A poorly constructed program can serve as a roadmap for prosecutors, damage morale, employees view code of conduct is merely lip service for the executives. The whole program is just a sham, and it encourages more fraud and unethical conduct. So what they say is you don't want a poorly constructed program because it's a roadmap, so people will know what you should have done and you didn't do it. So do the proper program from the very start. Otherwise, it's hard to make up for the errors that you make in the poorly constructed one because people are already used to having an inadequate program. It damages the morale and it creates more fraud and unethical conduct. Okay, anybody have questions, just let me know. You can put it in the chat and Shlomit can tell me. I'll try to look at the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll try to see that. Next. Other reasons to implement an effective corporate compliance program. Well, I'm going back to the US sentencing guidelines, not because they're US and we want to be US centric, not at all, but because it is the framework that has the most important features in it to make sure you have an effective program. So for example, another framework would be the OECD framework, but you're going to see it's leaving out background checks. You could see the COSO, Cocoa, and Cadbury Commission also have guidelines that are used by accounting firms. And these guidelines talk about concepts that are not really used by prosecutors, like control environment. It doesn't have a legal meaning. A control environment is meaningful for accountants, but not for lawyers. And the case law doesn't back it up. So we want to use what the case law backs up. For example, Interpol. I know that their curriculum includes the 7 steps. That's because I was asked to do the curriculum for Interpol for their Anti-Corruption Academy in Vienna, Austria. And the reason it was picked was because it has all the 7 steps plus the risk assessment. So when I go back and talk about the US sentencing guidelines, it's just because most of the prosecutors have learned that. They've either learned it from US prosecutors or it's now become what international prosecutors use. And that's who companies are most interested in. And that's the compelling reason they don't want to be prosecuted. They could be put out of business or given large penalties. So let's go back to that slide that we were on, other reasons to implement. One back, it's one slide back. I'm sorry, Shlomit. The federal sentencing guidelines were revised November 1st, 2004, required a culture, nope, wrong way. The other way. Sorry, Shlomit. It's next slide, that one. Yes, stay there. It required
I'm trying to get it, yeah. But,
yeah, you got it, right, perfect. And a Part C risk assessment or best practice and gaps analysis, best practices and gaps analysis to support the underlying structure of the compliance program. So when the US sentencing guidelines came out in 1991, they did not include the fact that you had to have a risk assessment, but in fact, this has become the very foundation and was done, in fact, in the good programs even before it was made part of the sentencing guidelines. Also, the emphasis on culture of ethics. You want to create the right culture in your company. And it's not just to comply with A, B, C, D, and it's like check the box. You want it to be holistically ethical. So that's a very important part of this. So let's go to the last part of that slide. I think there's somewhere there. Okay, and the Justice Department, the US Justice Department has also provided guidance on sentencing, and they talk about the existence and adequacy of the company's compliance program being important. We can go to the next slide. All right, now other reasons are New York Stock Exchange rules. So these are what would compel a company to have a good corporate compliance program. And next, there's another part to that. And you have all these slides in front of you. The NASDAQ similarly requires that. Next. And a very compelling reason is the large fines that have accrued. For example, with Bank of America, the fines were over $16 billion. Let's go on. And there's a list of them on the previous slide. Now, the other one is other reasons. We could stop here, Shlomit. This is perfect. Other reasons to implement an effective corporate compliance program. The Caremark decision, Delaware Chancellery Court 1996, talks about personal liability for the directors for failure to oversee the compliance program. Now, remember, directors have fiduciary duties, the duty of care, and the duty of care is in decision-making and overseeing the day-to-day responsibility. So this would be the duty of care and oversight, as well as the duty of loyalty. Also, besides saving the directors from personal liability for failure to oversee the compliance program, there is also avoidance of non-prosecution agreements, NPAs, and deferred prosecution agreements with the government. And finally, the National Association of Fraud Examiners, and this happens to be the 2014 survey, but same thing happens every year they do the survey, almost the same numbers, shows that the amount of corruption in a corporation can be lowered by 51% with a hotline where reported violations are followed up by the company. So can you imagine? You can lower everything by just following up on your hotline reports. Now, the guideline history, go back one. As I said, it started November 1st, 1991, and it gave the 7 steps for an effective program. This was used to sentence corporate entities. There had not only been sentencing of individuals, but you could give final penalties for corporations. So that was considered part of the sentencing. Now, the U.S. The U.S. federal sentencing guidelines revised November 1st, 2004, and provided for a culture of ethics. Compliance and ethics should be synonymous. The right things to do versus the right thing to do. The right thing to do is the ethics piece. The right things to do are what you have to do to comply with the law. And the test, they say, is, would you like your mother to see this blasted all over the internet, or would you be shamed for it? So do the right thing. And finally, that 2004 included the Part C risk assessment. So risk assessment is going to be very important, and this is a legal risk assessment. I just want to tell you that if you're doing crisis management, you are going to start looking at all kinds of risks: force majeure, acts of God, operational risk. We're just looking at legal risk because this is a legal risk assessment for compliance, because we want to be complying with laws and regulations on a global basis. Next. Okay, the Part C risk assessment, the legal risk assessment, plus the 7 elements to create an effective compliance program. Remember, the word is effective. Next. A Part C risk assessment. These are some of the areas that you should typically look at to make sure it keeps going, Shlomit. Some of the areas you should look at when doing your risk assessment. You will see that cybersecurity is under here, but we do not have AI on the list yet, but it is an important risk. So if you could just go through, just show the vast number of laws and regulations one must comply with. And what we do is a risk assessment, and we then prioritize those risks. Next. Okay, you're going to see more coming up. Here are some more of the risks from AML, conflicts of interest, customs export, cybersecurity, employment, environmental, advertising, bribery, FCPA, OECD. There's more of them, gifts and gratuities. You can keep going, Shlomit. There's a lot more coming up. Government insider trading, intellectual property, lobbying, new business, procurement, sexual harassment, subcontractors, subsidiaries, and consultants. Okay, now we're up to the next part. So this is that like checklist of all the different kinds of things that can be risks in a company. And then there are, of course, the laws of the area that they are. If they're an oil company, oil and energy laws. If you're a pharmaceutical company, FDA, Food, Drug and Drug Administration. So you have food and drug laws. Now we have the 7 steps. I'm going to give it to you in an easy way to understand it. So the first one is standards, procedures, and internal controls to prevent and detect criminal conduct. Okay, that's the first thing you need. And we're going to explain what standards, procedures, and internal controls are. Standards are things like your code of conduct, your mission statement, your vision statement. Procedures, how do you implement those standards? So what are your procedures to deal with environmental issues or antitrust issues or AI issues in the case we're going to talk about? And then what controls you can have. It should usually be a second set of eyes. For example, 2 signatures on a check is a control. It could be having the another department besides compliance take a look at it. So you might have your auditing and monitoring for bribery looked at also by internal controls. Next is the board. It must be knowledgeable and oversee the program. And nope, go back. And top management must ensure the effectiveness of the program. That's the board oversight, tone at the top. And also you have to have a specific individual with high level personnel, and they need the title too, to have responsibility for the program. That's usually the chief compliance officer. It may be the general counsel, chief compliance officer. And then they could have individual siloed programs under them for compliance with antitrust, or in this case, artificial intelligence or cybersecurity. And they need enough money and enough personnel to run the compliance department. So you need board oversight, you need top management input and oversight, and then you need an individual who runs the compliance program. And under that compliance program are the different top priority program. In this case, it's the AI program. That's a siloed program. And reasonable efforts to include within substantial authority personnel or individuals who organization knew or should have known have engaged in illegal activities or conduct inconsistent with an effective compliance program. This means you need to do background searches on the people in the company, as well as, so all employees, officers, directors, as well as suppliers, vendors, agents who work on the area. You have to make sure that you've done all those background checks, because a back alley in to, for example, antitrust or AI would be your law firms, your cybersecurity experts, your accountants, whoever has access to your computer systems could go in and do something. So you want to make sure you do background checks on everybody. In this case, computer programmers, all your multiplayers would be very, very important. But we're going to go through this in the next set of slides. I just want to give you the basics. So don't think only about the people in your company, but the people who also relate to your company who could go in and change something for the company, because they have backdoor into your computer structure. Then it's communicate standards and procedures by training directors, employees as appropriate, agents by other means. So you need to train all of your employees on this, and deeper training for those who need to know more. So people that are working, for example, with AI need more training, as well as your agents who are working in that area, your suppliers, vendors, contractors, independent contractors. We talk a little bit about the responsibilities of independent contractors working for the entity who owns the AI, but we'll get back to that later. Next, 5. Okay, auditing. Okay, number 5 is auditing, monitoring, testing, and surveillance. Now, auditing and monitoring, you want to add to that testing the system, so you continually test how it works. How does your AI work? Is there problems with it? You have to test it out. You have to audit it. You have to monitor it, and you have to survey it, meaning you look in people's computers, provided you're in a jurisdiction that allows that, and you survey what they're doing to detect criminal conduct. Evaluate the program periodically means that you should have not just every 3 years look at the program for compliance with laws and regulations and look at your risk assessment, but you should be doing this on a periodic basis so that you get snapshots, as well as, we're going to talk about in a minute, continually. And have and publicize a system of reporting suspected violations and seeking guidance, meaning you change the names, but you talk about people that may have violated either within the company or in the industry. So you bring the issues home, and people do e-newsletters about this. And then promote and consistently enforce through proper incentives to perform in accordance with the program and appropriate discipline. What is appropriate discipline? Appropriate discipline is really looking at, have they violated your requirements, in this case for AI, and creating AI and access to AI and how it's done and it's not biased and all of these things. So again, you want to look at disciplining people, but you also want to look at incentives. What incentives have you set up? Well, the best known case for incentives is the Wells Fargo case. In Wells Fargo, they found out that the people that were working on the accounts with the clients were opening and closing the bank accounts, and they were doing that so that they could cross-sell, and they needed to do it within that 1 month period, because if they opened and closed a bank account in the 1 month period, they would automatically get $50, even if they didn't sell in. And this promoted really misconduct and illegal activity, because you're not allowed to go into brokerage accounts and checking accounts and things and just open and close them. And that's what was happening in Wells Fargo. People didn't know about it. So for 5 years, during that 5 years, about 1,000 people a year were terminated at Wells Fargo, low-level people who open and close bank accounts to make a little bit of extra money on that $50 and try to cross-sell, that violated the client trust by opening and closing their bank accounts. Okay. So finally, this was being pushed by the top management and the CEO, and finally that person resigned. and took responsibility for what had happened. So you don't want to have the wrong incentives to make money, to cross-sell. And that's what happened in Wells Fargo. And then finally, after criminal conduct is detected, take reasonable steps to respond appropriately and prevent further similar conduct, including necessary modifications to the program. This has come to mean that you continually update the program every time there is a problem, every time there's a crisis. You go back. Did you do a good risk assessment? Did you have the right standards, policies, and procedures? Did you have the right oversight? Did you have the right administration of the program by the chief compliance officer? Number 3, did you have the right training? Number 4, did you number 3, did you have the right background checks? Number 4, did you have the right training? Number 5, did you have auditing, monitoring, testing, surveillance? Number 6, did you have good incentives and proper discipline? And that includes doing performance evaluations on your employees that are dealing with any issues, but in this case, AI issues, and make sure that you gave them bonuses for doing the right thing, and of course, discipline and no bonus if you did the wrong thing, or termination. And then, so continually update the program for everything. And finally, have protocols for internal investigation. That's all part of 7. You should have protocols to internally investigate the problem. That brings us to the next slide. Okay, 7 steps for an effective compliance program are as follows. The elements, I go through each element here. We've talked about it a little bit. Written policies, procedures, and internal controls include standards of conduct or code of conduct, internal controls, mission statement, letter from the CEO, code of conduct or code of ethics, employee handbooks, corporate compliance program guidelines. Whatever your program is, whether it's the overall program or a siloed program just on antitrust or cybersecurity or AI, they should all have guidelines for it. So it's institutionalized. And if somebody leaves, you're handling it the same way. Also, align the code of conduct with the policies and the procedures, and then have internal controls. And make sure that everything aligns in all your subsidiaries, all the different countries you're in. So this is a very important piece that many people miss. Next. Second element, the board has oversight of the compliance program. Top management should take a leadership role and foster tone at the top. Designate specific high-level personnel to oversee the program. The compliance officer is critical to the success of the program, and the chief compliance officer should be appointed to coordinate the activities of compliance officers at subsidiaries or in silos. Let's say we have a compliance officer for AI, that's a silo. We want to make sure that's handled properly. Next. The compliance officer should have the following: directs access to the CEO and the board of directors and sufficient funds and staff. Very important. Can you go one slide back if you don't mind? I just want to make sure I got everything there. Board must oversee, have tone at the top, designate high level. Okay, we've got everything. Good. Next slide. Okay, we did that one, direct access and initial funds. Okay, we've done that. Okay, we've done that. Next. Okay, compliance officers' responsibilities include overseeing and monitoring. Oops, that's the slide we need, the one right before that. Now, in your mind, be thinking about some of these things like reporting lines. Are they direct or dotted? Direct reporting or indirect reporting with a dotted line, which means, does the compliance officer report directly to the board and the CEO, or do they report through general counsel or the chief financial officer or human resources? I've seen all kinds of things. Also, remember that there are 3 lines of defense. The first line is business people. The second line is the compliance department and the general counsel's office. The third line is internal audit. And just remember, you want to get people at the first line. the business people. If you can educate them, then they can say no to things that are not appropriate and yes to those things that are, and things that are gray, they should come back and talk to you about it. Things they can't do, they should come back and talk to you about. But they should know what they can do so they can do that initial cut. It's much easier than having it fall on the responsibility of a problem that the compliance department or the general counsel sees. Now, the fourth is a new line of defense, is government, but it's not yet fully established. And this deals with the board of directors overseeing under duty of care and duty of loyalty what is going on in compliance. Remember, duty of care is duty of care in decision-making and duty of care in oversight. Can you go back one slide? I think one slide got left out. Okay, this is an important slide. What are the responsibilities of a compliance officer? To oversee and monitor the implementation of the compliance program, to report on a regular basis to the CEO and the compliance committee, the board of directors if direct reporting, or if indirect reporting to the CFO, the general counsel, or other officer of the corporation. That would be indirect reporting. Periodically revise the program in light of new developments, develop and coordinate and participate in multifaceted educational training programs that focus on the elements of the compliance program, assist the financial management and coordinating internal compliance reviews and monitoring activities, and independently investigate and act on matters related to compliance, including the flexibility to design and coordinate internal investigations, developing policies and programs that encourage managers and employees to report suspected fraud and other improprieties without fear of retaliation. So this gives you some idea of the job responsibilities of a compliance officer. And if it's an AI compliance officer, then you apply it to AI. Next slide. Okay, this is the direct and indirect reporting, and then the 3 lines of defense. Very, very important to educate those business people as the first line of defense. Next. Third element. The third element is to make reasonable efforts to include in the compliance organization not to include in the organization persons of questionable integrity. So you want to do background searches on all employees. Now, you don't have to do it, but you can draw up the guidelines and have human resources do it. Okay. And also they could be done on the outside, but coordinated by HR according to your specs as the chief compliance officer. Background checks can only be performed at time of hire, promotion, and salary increases in most of the US, but you have to look at the individual rules because they're very, very localized. Background checks can only check, now in some jurisdictions, only convictions and not arrest records. So the fact somebody's arrested cannot be looked at. Only what are convictions, which means this is called ban the box. This means that you need 2 people, one who gets the background check and finds out that there's an arrest on it, so he doesn't show it to the decision maker so that they won't be influenced by arrest records, only convictions. And only potential employers, not third parties, can review social media in some places. So be careful with that. Again, this is not one size fits all. Also, it should be localized for each country, state, and jurisdiction. Just to say how unusual this process is, in New York, you cannot check salaries in any way. And if you have a conviction, you can only know about the conviction if that conviction relates to the job spec. So if somebody is doing drunk driving, you can't use that for a job as a treasurer or in the internal audit department, but you can use it if they're a delivery person. So you have to make sure it is a conviction that affects the job, but that's only in New York City and in a few other jurisdictions. So in most jurisdictions, you can find out about all convictions. Next. Okay, 4th element, effective communication of standards and procedures. Training should include the following areas: code of conduct, employment issues, conflicts of interest, anti-bribery issues, how you use different kinds of communication, all the things that are in your code of conduct. Training should be at the time of hire as well as regularly scheduled at least once or twice a year. And the types of training should be geared to the person being trained. So you could have special training for a board member versus a different training for the CEO. You might even do one-on-one training. Types of training include internet training or virtual training, train the trainer, and in-person training. Now, train the trainer is where you train on ethics. And so it's a small group. You could do it virtually if you do Zoom and you talk and do exercises back and forth. And the group that works together trains together on things like, what is it to steal? Or what is it to have a harassing environment? So again, you want to see what the norms are in the company and talk about, for example, using your computer when you're not supposed to, or taking home a pen once in a while may not be an infraction. But if you take home 1,000 pens and you do all your work on the company computer, that may be an infraction. So you've got to find out what is the standard, and we all have different standards for what's okay. For example, have you ever been to a restaurant and had somebody take home a glass or a cup, just shove it in their pocket? Well, again, if that happens, what do you do at that point? And you should know. Some people think that's just okay. You paid for the meal, you get the glass, or you get the salt shaker. So it's important to find out what the norms are, and you do that with train the trainer. The same thing for an environment that might, let's say, have harassment, bullying going on, sexual harassment. You want to establish what the norms should be, and you want to do it among your colleagues and your immediate supervisor or another colleague. Next, the fifth element. That's developing effective methods for monitoring, auditing, testing, surveying, reporting, and publicizing the system. You need to create an anonymous hotline and protect whistleblowers. Very important to protect those whistleblowers, and there are whistleblower statutes. It should not be confidential. It should be anonymous. And the reason I say that is because you may have to report to a prosecutor. So the hotline should have a way for you to say, if you want to be anonymous, we'll give you a number, call back at this time, and we'll talk to you more, and we'll try to get you some answers. We'll tell you where we are in investigating, but you can't say it's confidential. And this is one of the problems I have with people who use the term ombudsperson. Because an ombudsperson can tell you it's confidential when you talk to me, but I may have to tell other people, and that's very confusing if they have to tell a prosecutor exactly what you said, yet they may have to do that. Also, set up a regular auditing and monitoring schedule, including on-site visits and spot checks. Set up surveillance if you're allowed to do it in your jurisdiction, to look at their computers, see if there are any hot words. Like, they use quotation marks. They may not mean effective. They may mean that it's 1,000 bananas, which is $1,000 bribe. So quotation marks are often a way to look for that. But you can look now in surveying at certain word structures, and do predictive coding on that. Also, you want to test the system. You want to see if the hotline works. You want somebody calling it once a month, making sure everything's going. You want to test how they do, for example, looking at databases that may tell you about know your customers. So see if it brings up the bad things that this customer or made up customer may have. So again, that tells you a lot. Publicize the results of the compliance program so people know you have a compliance program, your employees, your officers and directors, and report results as appropriate. You may be a gatekeeper and have to report out to a government agency. For example, an environmental spill, you're a gatekeeper. You've got to report that very, very quickly to the authorities. Next. Okay, 6. The 6th element we talked about already, that was the Wells Fargo. You need good incentives that don't promote just making money, but promote also doing the right thing. And corrective actions for discipline. So written policy on discipline standards, create an incentive program that promotes revenue as well as ethics, dissemination of standards to new and existing employees, and performance evaluation for all employees, including criteria for compliance, values, ethics, integrity, attendance at training sessions, how they use their AI, whether they put biases in it. You could have things for the programmers there. Next, and the multiplayers, of course, and the independent contractors, of course. Seventh element, take reasonable steps to respond to detected criminal offenses. So if you detect offenses, create internal investigation protocols and report the criminal violations and constantly update the compliance program. So it's not only auditing at intervals compliance program, but actually going back and updating the entire compliance program as you see problems come up on a continuous basis. Now let's go and figure out how we're going to roll out this program. We've got a nice program. We have the elements. We've got a risk assessment. We're going to show you how to do it. Next slide. Okay, here's a 5-phase rollout of how to do this. And we're going to go through the high-level compliance assessment, developing an overall compliance blueprint, evaluating and developing the policies. In substantive areas, we're going to look at compliance training and implementation, and then we'll look at continually refining the program for self-assessment and monitoring and reporting. Next, phase 1, conduct a high-level compliance risk assessment. During phase 1, you should form a committee, request an inventory of documents. So these are the steps for a risk assessment. You need an inventory of documents. You need to interview key officers and employees and have interview questions. So that's 3 things. You need to prepare a report on the risk assessment. That's your executive summary. And you need to compare inherent risk, which are the risks that you find from this process of interviews and doing the inventory of documents, and find the inherent risks and ramp them and do a heat map of inherent risks, and then do inherent risks minus a control, something that will control this activity and tap it down. And that'll give you residual risks. That gives you a way forward. So you can have several controls if you want, but you want to tap down the risk, and you want to do a heat map that shows how you've lowered the risk using the controls from inherent risk to residual risk. Prepare the heat maps. You can also create dashboards for how you're going to roll this out, and prepare an executive summary if appropriate. Next, phase 1, we're still in there. Committees should be composed of at least the CEO or president, general counsel, CFO, internal audit directors. And if you're doing something on AI, then you want those constituents that are affected. You may want people that are in computer programming. You may want to deal with people that have access to AI, people that are helping to input the data for AI, who is coming up with the algorithms. You may want to include them at least in considering some of the things for the committee. But again, you want to make sure that you don't have the fox watching the hen house. So you need people that are independent, that are in the company from that also, so that they can be careful with bias and diversity issues. Next, phase 1, the committee should report to the audit committee of the board of directors or directly to the board of directors. You should request an inventory of documents, including written policies and procedures on key risk areas, employee handbooks, litigation logs, training manuals, corporate filings, existing codes of conduct, insurance policies. These are just some of the things. Interview key officers and employees of the company and all subsidiaries, including the president, business development, sales, marketing VP, the general counsel, outside counsel, the chief financial officer, human resources director, environmental health and safety director, if any, compliance officer, if any, and other key officers and employees as necessary. Okay, those are all part of phase 1. Next, Okay. Based on the interviews, prepare a report on risk assessment, including best practices and deficiencies based on the following questions. What are your key risk areas? What are the standards and procedures that you now have in place in these risk areas? What are the areas you have successfully limited risk and how? What areas should you improve through controls to limit risk? And what is happening in key risk areas? And then these are some of we're interested in AI, but some of the other areas, for example, antitrust, environmental, employment, intellectual property. I gave you a long list, insider trading. It could be import and export controls, whatever. Describe the company culture toward corporate compliance and limiting risk. So culture is very important, and you want to enhance a good culture of ethics. Next. Phase 1. If appropriate, present the report on the risk assessment, including best practices and gaps. The report should provide a risk assessment for relevant areas of law. The report should be presented to senior management and the board of directors. The report should be presented to officers of all subsidiaries who were interviewed. The report should include heat maps, and we talked about heat maps and dashboards. Buy-in of the report should be encouraged, and create then a work plan, which includes a timeline. Timelines are very important, so people know when you've reached certain points and they can expect the process to flow along for creating a compliance program or an AI compliance program. So you have target dates. So you need a timetable and an action plan, and that can be all put into the timetable, by the way. You can add the action plan in for times when there will be action and have where you've already gotten on the timeline. Next. Phase 2, develop an overall compliance blueprint. During phase 2, you should look at other codes of conduct. You should use the committee and focus groups to develop code of conduct. Customize the code of conduct to the company culture. Customize the code of conduct so it is suitable for all employees. Now, all this can be done for AI. So you can look at codes of conduct that talk about AI. You can use the committee and focus group to develop the provisions on AI for the code of conduct, customize the code of conduct to the company culture, customize the code of conduct so it's suitable for all employees on AI. Make sure the code of conduct is user-friendly and attractively packaged so people will look at it and can find it easily on the internet. Create a mission statement and a letter to the CEO to accompany the code of conduct, and create corporate compliance program guidelines, and they can be individualized for AI, for your AI or artificial intelligence. Very important to have guidelines for it so that you can produce them to a regulator and they can see how your program is structured. Next, phase 2. We're on phase 3. Good. Okay, phase 3. Evaluate and develop policies and procedures in substantive areas. In this case, it would be for AI. During phase 3, inventory your policies and procedures already in place, and then try to create ones you need. Align the code of conduct, the policies and procedures, internal controls, and employee handbook for AI. Wherever there's AI in it, align them so the same language, same terms, same understanding, and develop policies and procedures where gaps exist. Many of you don't have AI policies. So for artificial intelligence, you want to develop those, and we're going to talk about that. Borrow best practices where necessary from other subsidiaries, industry groups, law firms, trade associations, can help you, seminars, and there are some organizations like the Association of Corporate Counsel, Practicing Law Institute that I work with. Next. Thank you, Shlomit.
I enjoy my role as
you're very good.
Controlling
Thank you.
your
Thank you
slide. Wow, I love that.
Thank you. I know. Wow. But I couldn't do it and do the same thing. So
I know.
Thank you.
You were.
Thank you. Communication, training, and implementation. During phase 4, you should introduce the code of conduct, or if you have a policy on AI, you introduce that. The ongoing communications plan for AI, the training plan, the training materials, and the training schedule. Next. phase 5. We're almost at the end. Okay, continually refine self-assessment, monitoring, reporting. That means having management controls, internal audit, testing and surveillance systems, internal controls, incentive system that's appropriate, internal investigation protocols, and publicize your reporting results. Again, we'll see this all done for AI when I present that. But you can already see how you could implement these within this structure for the rollout, for the AI siloed compliance program. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Creating a siloed. I think there was a slide before that. I'm not sure. I think it's the siloed slide.
This one?
Is there one before that on siloed? Yes, creating a siloed, in this case, I was taught, no, you had it before, correct. That was when I was going to do it with antitrust, but it is when you create a siloed program, you're going to put everything into the silos. It's one further ahead, two further ahead, actually. Okay, this is for, we need phase 5 we just did, so we need the next slide after that. Creating a siloed program. Let me just say, when you create a siloed program, you have to make sure that you have hit all of the things for a risk assessment. So there were 5 pieces of risk assessment. Hello? Good. Okay, great. Okay, this is legal risk assessment for antitrust. Use the 7 steps for an effective program with the legal risk assessment. Next slide. Okay, we explained that. Now, this is Morgan Stanley. So I don't see the slide up there. It's a slide before is Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah,
okay.
We can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
In Morgan Stanley, which is a slide before, and that's the last slide we really need on here, if we can get that. There was somebody named Garth Peterson. And the reason I bring it up is he was involved in the Shanghai real estate market. And the Shanghai real estate market, particularly in Pudong, which is the island that was a small fishing island off of Shanghai, was not developed. And the Chinese decided they were going to develop Pudong to be their financial capital of China, Asia, the world. And therefore, they needed buildings, and they built amazing buildings by amazing architects, and they divvied up the land, and they had a Communist Party official from they had a government official who was in charge of that. And he got friendly with Garth Peterson. Garth Peterson used to check him out. And they created a scheme with a Hong Kong lawyer where they had a company with almost the same name. So you know how you have Inc. and LLP, and you have company, and you have partner. So he did a different thing, the same name, a different thing. And Garth Peterson was raised in Singapore. He was fluent in Chinese. He was fluent in English, Tamil, Malay, and he was just completely fluent in this, very well educated. He was the youngest managing director in all of Morgan Stanley, and he was getting, multi-million-dollar bonuses. So he starts creating projects to build big buildings for Morgan Stanley. They're doing very well. Every time he puts a share in, he puts in one in the dummy company that'll go to him and this government official and the Hong Kong attorney. And they have a very nice scheme going on. It goes for many years. And finally, one of the employees had come repeatedly, different employees say, these aren't exactly the same names. And he says, you don't know Chinese as well as me, or you don't know English as well as me. It's really the same name. Mm-hmm. And so this went on and on until a hotline call. And a friend of mine, Raja Chatterjee, was at Morgan Stanley. He was in charge of foreign corrupt practices and bribery at Morgan Stanley in the compliance office. And he ended up investigating. So it's over the holidays at the end of December. He's in the Caribbean with his family and he gets called. He goes immediately to Shanghai, and 2 weeks later, he's uncovered what's gone on. He goes to Garth Peterson and he says, "Garth, what are you doing?" And Garth says, "Well," and he says, "I see that you have this dummy corporation and you've been putting it in there and you have been trained." He was trained like 45 times, and some of the training was in-person training on bribery. He was warned about bribery in the Shanghai real estate market for years. So he knew, but he did it anyway. So the government, they self-reported at Morgan Stanley after they out.
We lost you for a moment.
Garth Peterson was told Raja Chatterjee from Morgan Stanley.
Carole, Professor Basri, we are losing you. So maybe try to move your mouse. All right.
All right.
We will continue with Professor Basri, very interesting and very educative work on compliance in general. And then we'll open it for Q&A, and then we'll take like 5 minutes break, and then she'll continue about AI self-compliance.
Fine. Okay, so I just want to finish on Morgan Stanley. Garth Peterson was told by Raja Chatterjee what had happened, and he said, "Thank you for coming. I've been living under such stress." It turned out that he had 4 families to support. He was married to 2 different women, had 2 different mistresses. He had one in Shanghai, one in Hong Kong, one in Bangkok, and another one in Singapore. And he had all these things going on in his life. And each of these women knew he was a managing director for Morgan Stanley in the Shanghai real estate market. So each of them expected private schools, beautiful apartments, chauffeur-driven cars. And then one of them came to him and said, "My family needs a family business. Please, can you give me that?" And he was under such financial pressure that even though he was making millions of dollars a year, it was just too much of a burden. He said, "I'm looking forward from being away from everyone and in jail." And in fact, that's what happened. Now, what did the government say? Well, this was reported on the hotline, and they wrote a declination from prosecution. It's not too long. It's under 20 pages. I suggest all of you have a chance to look at it. It's excellent. And it goes through the risk assessment, that they had done a proper risk assessment, that they had the right policies, procedures, and internal controls, that they had a compliance officer just devoted to bribery, Raja Chatterjee, and he had the staff and time to do this. They also found that they had oversight from the board, that they had the right reporting lines, that they had the right background checks. There was nothing, this was his first job, and he was extremely successful, Garth Peterson, so there was no way to tell. And they found that he had gotten the training. He had gotten plenty of training, including in-person training in Shanghai. And so that was not the problem. They'd done auditing, monitoring, testing, reporting, and a hotline where this was reported. They had the right incentives and discipline. However, what they said was, this was a rogue employee. And as a rogue employee, it acted as a shield to the compliance program, because there was no way the company could have known about this logically. So in this case, Morgan Stanley was never charged, but they did upgrade their system as they went ahead and did an internal investigation, that they constantly showed to the Department of Justice, and the Justice Department was satisfied that they were not part of the bribery. And so if you have an effective program, this is one way to insulate the company from prosecution or from an NPA or a DPA, a non-prosecution or deferred prosecution agreement, which could mean heavy fines, penalties, and a monitor coming into your company to run your compliance program, basically taking over your company in terms of compliance. And so I really strongly suggest, many times the government declines to prosecute, but we never hear about it. In this case, they wanted an object lesson, the US government, Department of Justice, to show that if you have an effective compliance program, it is a shield from rogue employee activity. And I think this is a good point to stop and come back for the AI, creating an effective AI framework.
I think the last slide is also very important because it's kind of like summarize this necessary steps.
Sure.
Yeah,
So
I really appreciate that, putting it together like that.
Right. So I want to just be very practical. Make your compliance rollout memorable. You should have mementos, things for them to think about it, screensavers, calendars, internet sites, a formal announcement, invitation to compliance event. Now, this is an important concept. Remember, it is a marketing campaign, and your product is a compliance program, and your audience is your employees. Now, this is very important in AI because people will be resistant. It's a very creative process. So you want to remember, it is a marketing campaign. You want them to buy your product, compliance. The product is your AI compliance program, and your audience is your employees, but it will also be the prosecutors and your investors and your directors and your management. These are all part of your audience to know that you have a good, effective compliance program.
Okay. So I think now we'll open it. We'll open the floor for questions in this regard. We'll take like 3 questions, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll continue with the AI. So whoever wants to ask a question, please do.
Okay.
Yeah. So first, Danielle, go ahead. Then Tomer.
I just wanted to know, not having a corporate compliance program might consider as a breach of fiduciary duty or as a duty of care?
Yes. So fiduciary duty is the general term, and then there is the 2 duties, which is the duty of care, which has 2 parts: duty of care in decision-making and duty of care and oversight. This would violate the duty of care and oversight. The other fiduciary duty, besides duty of care, is the duty of loyalty. This is also very often found to be a breach of the duty of loyalty by the board of directors. Also, when you say fiduciary duties, this is not just the board of directors, but every corporate officer and every employee, for the task that they have a duty of care in decision-making and in oversight of their responsibilities, and they all have a duty of loyalty. So fiduciary duty is a very confusing term, I think, because it encompasses all of the employees, top management, directors, and encompasses duty of care in both parts, as well as duty of loyalty. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. Good question.
Tomer, yeah, go ahead.
So basically the whole idea, yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
So basically the whole idea of the AI over here, based on what I understanding, is actually to getting into a program from both sides to recognize if the system doing something wrong, or follow employees, or even interview employees, or create the whole regulation by the AI. So eventually everything going to be monitored by the AI, And am I correct? Am I right so far, basically?
You're basically correct, but I would save this question a little bit until we get into the next presentation, which is specifically on AI. And we're going to talk about what goes in and what comes out. Okay.
I just want to generally explain that we build it like we are taking the compliance guidelines, which Professor Basri cleverly and wonderfully developed, and we want to implement it into the AI industry facing lack of regulation in this industry. So that, therefore, we had to explain compliance at the first place, like in corporate law in general, and then we'll have the second part of the presentation, which will focus more on AI.
Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Basically, the AI going to replace everything in the end and just control it and better monitor it and faster results for everything.
So I really identify with your comment and question, because when I first heard these compliance, so that's what I thought. I mean, it's a brilliant thing to take this compliance and implement it.
Even recognize something up front already, like assessed risks.
Right. That's our next book for.
Shlomit was really, I was doing antitrust compliance for the last 2 years with her for the program at Oxford and Fordham. And she saw in that this could be applied to other areas. Now, I have applied it to I have a book published by Lexis on corporate compliance practice guide. And I apply it to about 20 different industries, but I applied it to cybersecurity. I applied it to energy issues. I went through products, and I also went through areas of law and looked at it from that format. What would you apply compliance to? So this is an extension of, you can apply compliance to anything and everything, including, I believe, your life. If you do a proper risk assessment and then you look at the 7 steps, you will have a way even to look at your own life. But clearly, areas of law fit in beautifully under this regimen, this framework, because I have examined so many frameworks, and I've written articles on this about for China that was asked by the government to get involved with the major industries there and how they could create compliance programs. Also in France, I was asked, and I did it with a program from the Sorbonne where I wrote an article on it, and they were just bringing in their compliance laws. And it's very convincing when you look at other frameworks and you see where these other frameworks are lacking pieces that are so necessary. Because again, if you don't do background checks, how can you find patterns? If you don't do the proper kind of structure or incentives or there's so many ways that you can have a problem if you don't go through each of these steps and do a proper risk assessment. So that was an excellent thought. Thank you very much.
Sure, I think it was last thing. I think it was the best example about the rogue employee over there that went to Shanghai and did whatever he did. If you had AI involved over here, we recognize him right away and wouldn't have to go through all that process, because he had a good thing going for a while, I would say.
Oh, he did this for about 9 years, and he basically got away with the scheme because nobody realized that the shares they were putting into this other company were not held by Morgan Stanley. He was putting shares for these different projects he was doing into his own company, and then it could be divvied up between, the government official from China, the lawyer in Hong Kong, and himself.
Okay, let's move to the last question, because we really need 5 minutes break. So
sure,
thank you, Tomer, and it's a wonderful question, and Danielle. Uriel.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture. A quick question: how big a corporate needs to be in order to implement these shields? Because we're talking about a big investment in money to have all the shields. So not every company can have them.
The answer is it doesn't cost very much money. Everything that I've told you can be done by a very small company with off-the-shelf tools. So, for example, a hotline could be just having somebody designated at one of these companies. It costs about $3,000 even for major companies to get the phone picked up. It's not expensive. A really big company might be spending $25,000 a year for all the languages. So if a small company only gets a few phone calls or email, that's one thing. Or you can set it up by yourself. You can have something that's done through an attorney or an accountant, or you can just have a box that people put things in, or an email box that people put things in that's looked at by a third party, not you. So you don't see names and specifics, and that can be taken care of until you make sure you've sanitized it. So it doesn't have to be, that's the most expensive things. Auditing, monitoring, testing, and surveillance can be done. You may not do that kind of surveillance, but you may look over people's shoulders. You may look at emails that you've received from other people with your computer people, if you think there's a problem. Background searches are not expensive. Setting up standards, policies, and procedures are not that expensive. There are off-the-shelf things. I have a book that has almost everything you need to set up a compliance program. It costs you, just to buy the book by Lexis, or you can buy pieces of it. And it even has the sample formatting. Do a risk assessment. You're just going to inventory your own documents, interview questions. Again, better to do maybe with a third party there, but you can do it on your own. And then heat maps and dashboards. Just find the programs and make your heat maps.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, wonderful. I really recommend the books.
Thank you.
And the lectures, and thank you very much for part one, Professor Basri, and thank you all. And we'll take like 5 minutes break, and then we'll.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
See you soon.
See you. Bye.
Okay, so after we heard in general about compliance in corporate law, we would like to move into AI compliance guideline compliance framework.
Right.
We'll continue with Professor Basri, and the stage is yours.
First of all, I want to say thank you again to Professor Ravid. She is amazing, and she really taught me a lot about this area. I've been reading her articles, and they're absolutely brilliant. Generating Rembrandt is fabulous. I'm sure you've all read it, but I've read her other articles, and she really covers the different aspects, the privacy issues, the intellectual property issues. And I want to say what a great contribution this is that she's making to the field of artificial intelligence, that she has done this and examined things so carefully, and then gone on to teach all of us about it. So thank you, Professor Ravid. I want to say that this has been one of the most interesting things I've worked on in a long time. Now, understand, it's again creating an effective AI compliance framework. I am going to tell you right at the beginning, I don't know if this is effective yet. That's because the challenges of AI are so large that I don't know whether, in fact, I have the makings, but I think this is an evolving kind of thing. And what was effective in compliance in 1991 and 1992 and 1993, when I started doing compliance programs, would never be considered effective today. And so I would venture to say that the AI compliance program that we're going to talk about is as effective as it can be for AI compliance framework, and that you will see it organically grow into a very effective area. I don't know that somebody looking at where programs are today would say, oh, this is perfect. But I would say if they look at what had to happen in all those other areas to create effective programs, then they would say, yes, this is a start, and it's as effective as it can be for an AI compliance program at this time in 2021. So I'm using the word framework because I'm trying to bring it back to those steps rather than look at a particular program for a particular company. But everywhere I do say AI compliance program, I'm trying to relate it so that you think about it as a company. But in fact, the title is to create a framework usable by AI companies. Particularly, let's focus on facial recognition, voice recognition, things like this. Okay, so let's go to the first slide. Okay, artificial intelligence systems are creative, unpredictable, independent, autonomous, rational, evolving, capable of data collection, communicative, efficient, accurate, and have free choice among alternatives. Similar to humans, AI systems can autonomously create and generate creative works. Okay, so that is a definition I derive from Professor Ravid's work. You probably are all familiar with her work since you're in this class. So that's my starting point for what is AI. Okay. Next, so you have to identify to be able to create a compliance program. What is it? How are AI systems used? Okay. So the use of AI systems is in the production of works, either for personal or manufacturing purposes. It has become common in the 3A era of automated, autonomous, and advanced technology. So we have automated, autonomous, and advanced technology. Let's go to the next slide. What are the concerns around AI? Again, I'm working off of Professor Ravid's work. But I totally agree, as I've examined and been talking to people and learning about this area, that there is a deep and common concern in modern society that AI technology will become uncontrollable. There is therefore a call for social, legal, and ethical tools to regulate AI systems and outcomes. Now, I use the word regulate because I don't think you can control. I think you can regulate what's there, okay? So I don't want to get into that control issue and go more toward regulating the AI system's functions, because it is all of those things we talked about: creative, unpredictable, independent, autonomous, evolving. So I think regulating it is where we want to be. Next. Okay. Can the concerns about AI be reduced by an effective compliance framework? I believe that an effective compliance framework can reduce AI concerns in the following areas: promote a culture of ethics by the entity when using AI, promote a culture of good citizenship by the entity using AI, promote the 3 lines of defense. Now, remember we talked about 3 lines of defense: the business people, the general counsel and compliance office, and then the 3rd line was internal audit. I believe that we can promote the 3 lines within the entity by using AI. Also, we can promote the 4th line of defense, governance, with the entity using AI. So governance issues with the board of directors, and most specifically, the fiduciary duties of the board of directors, which I said under the Gantler case also apply to employees, and they also apply to management. So to promote the fiduciary duties, the duty of care and decision-making and oversight of AI, and the duty of loyalty when utilizing AI by stakeholders, you can promote privacy, you can promote copyright protection, and intellectual property protection in general, because sometimes this will also relate to patents and things like that. So copyright protection and intellectual property in general. Next. Okay, creating a siloed. Now, this is going to be a siloed program. Remember, we talked about how you can have an overall program for a company, or you can silo it in a particular area. What is the particular area? In this case, it's not cybersecurity, it's not antitrust, it's not bribery, it's artificial intelligence. So that's going to be our siloed area. And we're going to apply the legal risk assessment for AI. We're going to do a legal risk assessment, and we're going to use the 7 steps for an effective compliance program. Next. Okay, now here is promote an effective legal risk assessment for the company, AI company. Now, this is a little hard to read. So I'm going to explain it to you. First, promote an effective legal risk assessment for AI within the entity based on the following. You need 5 things, right? One is an inventory. Now, we said inventory documents. Here, though, it's going to be an inventory of AI-related data, generally accepted best practice algorithms, and specially created algorithms, okay? Also, you're going to have sample interview questions based on AI concerns as follows. Now, these are some of the interview questions, and you're going to have people to interview. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But what would be my starting point for questions? And this is one of the areas that we really can do a good job on. How was the training data set prepared? So you need training data sets, and you want to find out who prepared the data set for training and what data sets were used to train the AI systems. So you're going to have individual data sets, and then you're going to have 2 competing data sets to see where you are. That's one way to do it. But you want to know, how was the training data set prepared? Who prepared it? What data sets were used to train the AI system? So you might want 2 competing ones. Where did the data come from? Could the data set be biased? Was the data set collected in accordance with privacy concerns? So were you concerned about privacy when you did it? Did you get material that you just pulled off of anywhere without getting the right to use it, or was it done with privacy concerns? Was the data set collected in accordance with intellectual property right concerns? Where did you get the property that you used? Did you worry about that? Such as acquiring copyrights to data. That's why places like Apple, Facebook, things like that can be so successful, because they may own the data that you use because you may have agreed to give it to them to be part of the system. Who is the custodian of the data sampling used to train the AI system? How were the labels used on the data created for the data sets for training the AI system? Who was overseeing the process? Okay, so you have to label, and then who's overseeing it? Who is providing oversight into prevention of malicious attacks, such as spoofing? Spoofing is a real problem. And I don't know if you've discussed spoofing before, but that's, for example, you're creating an autonomous driving machine, and it says 65 miles an hour, and you cover it up to 65 miles an hour so that you can't see anything there. Now, a person automatically knows that there's tape on there or that it's been painted over, but the autonomous car may not have been given data on looking for that, and therefore doesn't realize that the sign has been maliciously spoofed on them. And there are several examples I can give you of that. Malicious attacks such as spoofing can alter the results. Were at least 3 independent experts used to label data for the data sets used in training the AI system? Because remember, you're training it, but it is going to go and learn on its own because it has the ability to be creative, unpredictable, independent, autonomous. It's capable of collecting additional data, and it has free choice among alternatives. So very human qualities. So again, what you can look at is how are the labels used on the data created for the data sets for training the AI system? Who was overseeing? Were you provided insights on prevention of malicious spoofing? And then were at least 3 independent experts used to label data that was used in the training AI system? Now, if there was a disagreement among the independent experts used to label data, was there a panel to oversee the decision-making? Now, if you're creating Rembrandt, that may not be a problem because Rembrandt is gone. You can study his strokes. If you've made a mistake, so it's another canvas, it's not an issue maybe. But is it an issue if you're doing facial recognition or autonomous driving? And I would dare say it would be an issue, okay? And that if there's a disagreement, you have independent experts that can use to do it and can oversee the decision-making, because these are critical decisions. Okay, now, the next one is, can you describe the type of data assembled? How was the data assembled? How relevant is the data to the goal of the AI system? Because if it's irrelevant, or if it takes you down a path that won't meet the goal, you may get different results. And what was the methodology for testing once the AI system was trained? So testing becomes important. Now, those are just a few of the questions. I'm sure Professor Ravid will come up with some additional ones, and each of you will come up with additional ones. But those are the ones I was able to deduce. Next, let's go to the next slide. Continue. Promote an effective legal assessment for the AI compliance program. Remember, there are 5 steps. So we've done the inventory, we've done the interview questions. Now, interviewees should include the following: executive management, the board of directors, employee, multi-players. You've been learning about multi-players. So those should be considered, all the multi-players. Independent contractors, consultants, software programmers, law firms, accounting firms, vendors, agents, and data providers. All of them should be interviewed and asked questions. And the questions won't necessarily be those I gave you. We've asked the first question. It'll lead to a series of questions going down the line. That series of questions is very important. You have to take your time. You can't rush the process, because you've got to find out about biases, about the reliability of the data set, if you have copyright on them, if you have the right to use them, if you've observed privacy rights, and maybe only data providers can give you that, or software programmers, or law firms, or accounting firms, whatever. Then you need to do heat maps of AI inherent and residual risk. Residual risks are found after using controls. Okay, so you can put a control in, like it's going to be looked at by a third party, or a panel of people are going to look at the labeling, all kinds of things. Or there may be residual risks, maybe a control on not looking at certain items because they would provide bias and prejudice, because let's say society was prejudiced 20 years ago. So if you're looking at facial recognition databases from 20 or 30 years ago, it may not have the diversity that's in society now. So again, very careful analysis needs to be used here. Also, AI executive summary of legal risks, including AI inherent heat maps and AI residual heat maps. And I hope you all know what heat maps are. If you don't, Google Images has heat maps on there. They also have it for dashboards. And I suggest it's a good thing to look at and learn about, because you can use heat maps with business people and non-lawyers like programmers and things. They'll get it much faster than a long explanation. Okay, now, so you've done your 5 steps for the legal risk assessment for AI. Let's go to the next one. Okay. Promote 7 steps for an effective AI compliance program. Promote effective standards, policies, procedures, and I've added the word guidelines also, and controls. We're going to talk about guidelines in a little while. There are some guidelines out for AI, and I just want to show you what some of them are later in the conversation. Promote effective reporting lines and an AI compliance officer and an AI compliance staff. So you need the reporting lines up to the board, up to the CEO, the management, and you want to also have an AI compliance officer and an AI compliance staff if necessary. And if I was a facial recognition or voice recognition company, I would think about having those kinds of designated personnel involved. Now, promote effective background checks for software programmers, data providers, and other members of the entity concerning histories of data spoliation. Background checks should include all members of the entities, such as executive management, the board of directors, employees. Background checks should also include outside vendors, agents, providers of services, including but not limited to independent contracts, multi-players, consultants, law firms, and accounting firms. Again, you need to think about doing background checks on anybody, either internal background checks for employees and people that you hire, or the more extensive background checks you can do on agents, vendors, providers, independent contractors, because you're not limited to the background checks on employees. They vary. And again, look at local rules for that. Also, we want to promote effective AI training, including in-person training at the time of hire and at least one time a year. Virtual training and train the trainer training. Training should be given to the executive management, the board of directors, employees, multi-players, independent contractors, consultants, software engineers, law firms, accounting firms, vendors, agents, and data providers. Again, different kinds of training. You don't want to waste training, but the targeted training on the people that need the training. HR should have profiles on what kind of training you're going to provide to each group, and make sure you do your vendors, agents, providers, and train them, because maybe nobody else will train them in the data providers. Next, promote effective AI auditing, monitoring, surveillance, and reporting, including an AI hotline script. So your regular hotline is what you use, but include an AI hotline script that takes you down a decision tree for AI-related hotline disclosures, so that you can ask the appropriate questions, because this is usually done by somebody that may not know too much about AI. That concern whistleblowers. Auditing and monitoring should be performed continuously, as well as full audits at least every 6 months in these areas. I might even do more often, like 3 months, but you want to continuously do it wherever there's a problem, and then full audits at least every 6 months. Promote effective and systematic discipline, including unethical use of AI and effective incentives to promote the ethical use of AI. So performance evaluations can come in very handy, but you can also have client evaluations and vendor evaluations, but evaluate this and give bonuses for people that act, again, ethically. Promote effective updating of the legal risk assessment for AI and the 7 steps, as well as protocols for the AI internal investigation, because that investigation is going to be different than your general protocols for an internal investigation. At this point, AI is somewhat an unknown quantity, because you put the data, the algorithms in, some are generally accepted, some are individual for the process. The data could come, we are not sure. So the data sets become very important, what they learn on. And so you really need to test, survey, to train, you need to have policies, procedures, and internal controls. You need to do all these things, the 7 steps, plus a good risk assessment. At this time, this is what we're capable of doing. Next slide. Okay, current AI guidelines. Now, I think this is interesting because there's a lot of current AI guidelines, and I think I heard some new ones from Professor Ravid that I'm going to be interested in talking to her about. There's the EU April 21, 2021 protocols for regulation of artificial intelligence with prohibited high risk, low risk AI focusing on transparency and accountability. I provided you with hyperlinks where I have them. NIST proposal to identify and manage basics in artificial intelligence, the FTC blog talking about aiming at truth, and then FTC action on AI reflecting the FTC. The EU high level, I think this is the one Professor Ravid mentioned EU high-level expert group on artificial intelligence, ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. Then there are the OECD principles on AI, the Artificial Intelligence Australia's ethics framework. China has one, China Cyberspace Administration of China, an artificial intelligence security white paper produced by the China Academy of Information and Communications Technology. And then finally, the US Subcommittee on Information Technology and the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, Rise of the Machines, Artificial Intelligence, and its growing impact on US policy. I suggest that if you're really interested, take a look at what some of the new AI guidelines, these soon could turn into regulation. So there is enough there that we can start looking, and I'm so thankful to Professor Ravid for pointing that out to me, because I find this very interesting. Now, if we go to the next slide, there's not much left. Okay. In the Morgan Stanley 2012 Declination from Prosecution, an effective corporate compliance program created a shield from prosecution resulting from the activities of rogue employees. I would venture to say that you could have a rogue software programmer who input data or algorithms in that created an unnecessary bias, something that even was racially, ethnically, religiously biased. They could inadvertently have done that. It could be gender-based. Whatever this is, you could have a rogue employee doing it. You need to be able to create, as much as possible, the best shield you can. And I would venture to say that that is going to be a tough proposition right now, because of the fact that you have to look at three things, I think, and this is something Professor Ravid pointed out. You need to look at ownership, you need to look at responsibility, and then you need to look at compliance. If we can pick out the owner, then we can separate out responsibility. Responsibility may be licensed out, and then we can get to compliance. And we've got to be thinking of those three things as we go through this process. So I think that if you go through compliance, as I am explaining it to you with the risk assessment, which you learned about overall, now in a siloed artificial intelligence risk assessment, and then the 7 steps for an effective program, you can come out creating, I would say now, somewhat of an effective shield. However, you're gonna have to be very, very careful, particularly, I think, actually with the background checks, which is, as I told you, the model that they use in the OECD anti-bribery doesn't even have background checks in it. So background checks becomes very fundamental in looking at who are the people that you have working and creating your AI system. That is as far as I've come on this journey. I'm looking forward to many years of updating what makes an effective compliance program. I can tell you that we've already had since 1991, which means 30 years of updating compliance programs, to see the kinds of programs we see in banks and financial institutions, in pharmaceutical companies, but AI will be as rigorous as these are, as rigorous as anti-money laundering, as rigorous as bribery, anti-bribery compliance programs. But that rigor will come as we learn more about this thing called artificial intelligence, which we've learned are creative, unpredictable, independent, autonomous, rational, evolving, capable of data collection, communicative, efficient, accurate, and has free choice among alternatives. When we kind of figure this out a little more, it's going to become more effective. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be on the road to compliance. So thank you all for listening to me. I hope this was helpful. And again, I want to thank Professor Ravid so much. Really enjoyed this journey so far.
Yeah. All right. We are heading like a long journey, and we are just fastening your seatbelt because we are on the way to the future. Anyway, thank you, thank you, Professor Basri. It was really fascinating, and there are so many more things to say and to develop in this area, and we are going together. And I'm really grateful for your thoughts and sharing these ideas of combining compliance regime with artificial intelligence, and also thank you for reading my articles.
Oh, your articles are fascinating. I'm like, just it opened up my mind. I didn't realize that the creation of music, the creation of art, the possibilities in the pharmaceutical business, writing novels. It's just a fabulous new frontier, and I hope that mankind uses it wisely, because like everything else, it can be used well or not. Let's hope that the work we're doing helps us to do it in a positive way.
Yeah, so thank you very much. It's just the first steps, and we are looking forward to work together in the forum of legal, ethical vision AI that we are creating.
Thank you.
So thank you. And we'll move to our last speakers, Dean Nichols from we have other, okay. So we are moving forward to our last speaker, Dean Nichols from USTO, facial recognition industry. And I think it's really important and surprisingly, as I already mentioned, we see that in many aspects, we are on the same page, and like we have like in many, I mean, although we like to think about facial recognition differently, so I think in a lot of perspective, we have the same interest, and the first one is getting some kind of regulation using maybe self-guidance and self-compliance as first step until Congress will come up. But so before letting the floor to Dean Nichols from USTO, I would just say that legislators, policymakers, academics, and others love to hate FRT, facial recognition technology. Many voices have called to ban FRT. And I think the main reasons behind this resistance movement are protection of privacy, equality, consent, transparency, and maybe in general, we can say human rights or civil rights. Seeing FRT as harmful and as violate human rights and civil rights, as mentioned. Moreover, opponents argue that not only FRT is biased and therefore malfunction, but it's also that the technology is deemed to be inaccurate and hence inefficient. So if I want to group, I want to address this, and I think hearing the industry is so important. Usually we skip and we ignore the voice of the industry, like policymakers have their own discourse and the industry have their own representative, have their own industry. But we are here to building bridges, especially with this forum that we envision and that is in the midst of creation. So if I want to group from maybe academic point of view, from my academic works, the criticism toward facial recognition technology, so I can bundle the concerns into 5 main groups. One is the technology aspect, inaccuracy, biases, discrimination, non-representative data set, lack of test of the data set, incorrectly matching images. The second group is really violation of human and civil rights, such as violation of privacy, threat to civil rights, and so on and so forth. The third group, I think it has to do with legal specific concerns or legal specific steps that are missing. And Professor Basri really addressed some of these concerns, like lack of consent and lack of transparency, the lack of right to appeal, right to delete, right to alternative, and so on and so forth. The fourth group, I think it stems from lack of regulation and unknown expectation and limitation, and lack of certified authority like the FDA to certify FRT. And it's unbelievable that this enforcement agency in the US and other places are using facial recognition without any entity to certify the accuracy and the liability and all these legal aspects around FRT. So, and it's even getting worse when we think about the use of FRT by everyone. And I think the fifth group is database. And I think that the industry has a lot of things to say about these issues, but we can differentiate between collecting the data, using the data, and preserving the data. And the lack of regulation is kind of like in each and every step. I just want to add that though much of this criticism is valid, the use of FRT by many and by police and governmental entity in different fields, we have a lot of positive aspects and prevention of crime, terror attack, or fraud, enable remote communication that we really need in this time of the pandemic, and remote medical treatment. So we can really, I mean, here, the FRT is here to stay and is undoubtedly like has very positive aspects. And the only question is how should we balance between the bad aspects and the good aspects? And I think these forum that have been grouped together industry representative, like exactly like we do today, and other policymakers and people from the academic world can come out with like the bridge, as I said, between the industry and policymakers and academic. I would like to turn to our last speaker, Dean Nichols, and like to address a few of these questions. How does FRT AI-based really work? Can the industry cure? Can the industry give answers, satisfying solution to public concerns about FRT, like biases, violations of people of color, the discriminated women, violating privacy, inaccuracy, and so on and so forth? Can FRT AI system anonymize the data? What is the influence of public view and publication on FRT industry? Do the industry differentiate between public policy and private sector, like employers? Do the industry differentiate between the system itself and its uses, or malicious use, or wrong use, or illegal use? And even assuming if the industry perfect the system, what should be the concerns? What should be the legal concerns? So I would like everyone, I mean, to think about these things, but I think first we'll have to give the stage to the industry. And we are so proud to have this stage where a representative of the industry can be a legitimate part of the discourse. And I'm thankful really to Dean Nichols from USTO that agreed to share inside information from the facial recognition industry. So Dean, the floor is yours. I will.
Yeah, you let me share my screen. We'll be off to the races.
Yeah, I'll do it in a moment. And
well, first of all, maybe while that's happening, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Dean Nichols. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at USTO. We're one of the leading facial recognition players out there. I'll argue one of the leading ethical facial recognition players out in the space. And really the purpose of this session today is to give you kind of a primer, really from a vendor's perspective on the state of facial recognition and what things we're doing to help make sure that we're helping kind of to eradicate some of the bias that's long kind of plagued kind of the technology. So let's see if I can share my screen.
Okay, yeah, one moment, because I have, yeah. So, yeah, you're welcome to share your screen.
Perfect.
And yeah. So
and maybe I can get someone to give me a thumbs up if they can see my screen.
We can see your screen perfectly.
Let me go to
the stage is all yours.
Okay, well, so we're all good to go?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So,
thank you.
So what I want to kind of cover in the next 45 minutes or so is just really talk about facial recognition in the news, talk about some of the different use cases for how facial recognition is being used in commercial use cases, talk about some of the ethical challenges, and then what are some of the ingredients of what an ethical facial recognition solution looks like. And then talk about maybe where regulations could go, where we think they should go. And then finally, just a couple of words about USTO. This is not meant to be a commercial by any stretch. We just want to help educate you guys about the state of the state when it comes to facial recognition from kind of a commercial perspective. So first, let me start with just talking about some of the key trends that we're seeing. Many of these, I'm presuming you guys have seen in the news. So, facial recognition is obviously controversial in some use cases, and increasingly it's suffering from a bad reputation. So you'll see I have little article snippets talking about how China's using facial recognition to track, the Uyghurs in Beijing and some of the challenges that they've experienced in the UK. What's important to understand as you read some of these headlines, clip from today's news, and often they're talking about public surveillance, right, by governments or often by police departments. And we're going to talk about, there's a lot of other use cases outside of that for facial recognition. Because of those stories, you're starting to see growing opposition for the use of facial recognition. So you have, the EU privacy watchdogs looking to ban it in public spaces. Amnesty International came out proposing a ban as well. And the problem is some of these bans are not fully thought out, and they don't really understand all the nuances of such a ban. And now we're starting to see it even happening, in the U.S. And where they're really targeting police departments. And some of that is I think, rightfully targeted. So I'm not here to defend the use of facial recognition by some police law enforcement, but I think we just need to be careful. These bans, when we see a ban for public surveillance with law enforcement, that also means that if you're looking for a missing child, they can't use facial recognition to help you do that if it's banned in the city. And so there has to be just a little bit more nuance to the dialogue and to some of these bans. And I think what the dangerous thing for us is that as a vendor of the technology is that one of the first questions we get asked on virtually every sales call is, tell me how your facial recognition is ethical. How are you trying to kind of weed out demographic bias and racial bias from your algorithms? And these stories that you see kind of clipped from today's news puts a real challenge on us, and even on use cases that are fairly non-controversial. So this is kind of just helping set the stage. I think most of you are aware of these stories. I want to talk a little bit about use cases because, again, not all facial recognition is the same. And so this is what we call our scale of sensitivity. And it goes from green to red. And on the green zone, you have you kind of unlocking your phone with your face. Well, that's facial recognition. The thing to point out is it has a white list, essentially what we would call a watch list of one. It's just you, right? As you move from left to right, as you move from green to red, you start to see that white list or that watch list grows larger and larger to the point where you're on the far into the red zone where virtually everyone in the population is on that list, right? So in the far right is where you have performing mass surveillance to subdue minorities, and 100% of the population is on that list. But in between, there are a lot of gradients, right? So it's important to understand when we talk about facial recognition, what's the exact use case we're talking about here? And so some cases like, for example, what we call access control, that means if I go into a building, instead of using a card key or a fob, I can now use my face to enter the building. Again, fairly non-controversial. And so this, I think, is a nice kind of provide some context for all the different kinds of facial recognitions in the market in terms of what's out there and then how that technology is actually getting used. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the differences between law enforcement and public surveillance use cases and commercial and loss prevention kinds of use cases, because they're radically different and the vendors are different. And so let me just talk about like law enforcement. And I'll talk about some of the problems with law enforcement and facial recognition. If let's say there is a crime, there is a stabbing on a railway station. If you're a police, if you're in the police department, what you want to do is quickly figure out who are some of the known suspects. And there are solutions out there, and one of the bigger ones is Clearview, and you might have heard of them in the news, usually for all the wrong reasons. Ideally, when a crime is committed like that, and you're just given some raw video footage, what you need to do is you need to try to match that against a large database as humanly possible, right? So what Clearview has done is essentially amassed a database of roughly 10 billion images. They're images of you and me, Professor Ravid, everyone here is presumably in their database. They've scraped the images from Google, from LinkedIn, from Facebook, and others places. They've called that within their public domain. Now, we might argue that's in fact in the public domain. But the way the system works is when a police department then gets that footage of that crime, they're then able to match it against this massive database. And then Clearview would say there's probably about 8 or 10 people that look like they could be potential suspects, right? But in order for that to work effectively, you need to have a massive watch list that you're then matching it against the video footage. And often this is being done after the fact, right? After the crime has been committed. On the other side of the house, the side of the house that Usto plays in, my company plays in, is in these commercial or loss prevention use cases. So for example, in the case of a casino, we work with a number of casinos in Las Vegas, and our job is to identify people in real time as they're entering a casino if they're on their watch list. Now, their watch list by comparison might have 150 individuals on it. It might be felons, it might be prostitutes, it might be card counters. It might be people that are self-confessed that they have gambling problems. And from a compliance perspective, they're mandated to approach them and make sure that they don't gamble within their facilities. In this case, the watch list is very finite. It's quite small, actually. And it's only recognizing the people that are on the watch list and then alerting security, right, that one of those people on the watch list has just entered the casino. And so this is a very different kind of technology, a very different use case. But it's important, again, to understand that there's a spectrum, right? And so one of them requires a massive database. And frankly, that's where a lot of the problems of ethics come in. That's at least one of the areas of ethics. And then the other side is this commercial or loss prevention space. Another example is like in retail, where that watch list might consist of people that are former shoplifters, or maybe you have some employees, ex-employees who were violent or prone to violence. And so you might have those folks on a watch list, and then when they come in, security is being alerted in real time that they just entered the store. So that gives you kind of a little flavor of just how broad facial recognition is. Again, this is not meant to be a commercial, but one of the solutions we offer is called On Watch. And the whole point of On Watch is to identify persons in real time with live facial recognition software. And I'm going to give you kind of a quick overview, because while a lot of people talk about facial recognition, they don't fully understand actually how it works. And so I want to show you actually how it works. And then I might just stop and answer maybe a few questions, and then I'll continue with the rest of my presentation. So what we're going to look at now is actually a sports stadium in Europe. And I'm going to show you how facial recognition actually works kind of in the wild, in production. So in this case, we have multiple cameras situated kind of within the stadium. We've identified a couple of people that are what we call persons of interest, POI, right? And so in this case, we've identified these two guys. And it could be that these are hooligans. It could be that they're problem folks that we want to make sure that security is alerted to them. So what we're going to try to do is with the camera systems we have in place, we're going to try to identify them. And so there we've identified the first guy, right? And what's amazing about that to me is that, again, we just saw him in profile and he was occluded by some other people. Now we're going to try to find the other guy. And there he is, even in the shadow. So this technology can work even when the person isn't looking directly at you, even when they're in the shadows, even if they're wearing a mask, right? So now in many stadiums, they obviously have multiple cameras. So now we'll look at a different camera, and here's kind of more of a crowded scene. And the idea is, can you try to find where is that person of interest? If you're relying on people behind, walls of screens, this can be very difficult. But with technology and facial recognition, we can single out the people that are on the watch list. We're effectively ignoring everyone else. So, by the way, it says AnyVision because our name prior to changing to Usto was AnyVision, but that is a quick overview of how the technology works at a super, super high level. Maybe I'll just stop now and just open to questions for anything I've covered thus far.
Yeah, if I can take the first one, but I'm willing to hear other participants, like what about transparency? What about consent? What about regulation, self-regulation? How do you test?
Yeah, we're going to get into that probably in the second part of my presentation, but so in many cases, in most cases, governments around the world are saying, if you're going to use facial recognition, you as a retailer, or maybe it's a stadium, must provide conspicuous signage that you're using facial recognition. So people, as they enter that stadium or that store, are aware of the use of the technology, right? But I think what's equally important is, as much as companies need to be transparent about that, they should also be transparent what they're doing and what they're not doing. So what we're not doing is we're not looking at and following kind of innocent bystanders as they traverse a store or a casino. We're really just focused on identifying the people that are known security risks. And so I'm going to spend probably the second part of the presentation talking about what kind of safeguards are we putting in place to kind of mitigate against bias, and how we're essentially policing ourselves. But I'm also going to make a case why we're actually strong advocates for regulations, because I think it would help all and provide a layer of transparency that doesn't exist today.
Yeah, Gil, go ahead.
Okay, so I understand that we have to be careful with being biased. The question is, what kind of bias are we talking about? Because if it's bias, racial bias, I understand. I can tell you that every time I go through the airport, every time, it's unbelievable, I get a note in my luggage that it was searched. Every time, no exception. I don't think I should be searched, but you know what? It doesn't really bother me. I understand that people that looks like me maybe, but that's racial. It doesn't bother me that much. But if it's a bias against people who are known to be criminals and they were scanned before and we have their fingerprints or their facial, so they are biased against, I think that there is a reason for that. Is there a problem with this kind of bias?
Yeah, again, if you're operating a casino or operating a store, you have a due diligence to your shareholders to try to prevent loss, right? And also to prevent harm to other people, like within the stadium. And so right now, if you think about if they were to do this without any kind of facial recognition, what they would be relying on are people behind walls of screens, and they're honestly asked to memorize the faces of hundreds of individuals. And then if they see those people on the screens or potentially security guards, then they're approaching those people. I would put it to you, which is going to be more or less biased, an algorithm or people who have to memorize faces? I would argue that the AI, if again constructed in the right way, would actually be far less biased than that. So I think I believe in capitalism. I believe in private enterprise, that they have a right to protect their stadium. They have a right to protect their store from known security threats. And so this is just automating that type of surveillance, right? As opposed to relying on the visual eyes of a security guard, now we're relying on technology to spot those people.
No, I agree. I'm sorry that I'm taking somebody else's spot for a second. I agree with what you're saying. My question is whether your mechanics follows people that looks a certain way or follows people.
I'm sorry. I should have been very clear. We start with every engagement with every customer, whether you're a stadium or a retailer, with a blank watch list. It has 0 people in it. So we don't, unlike Clearview, we don't start with a watch list of 10 billion people. We start with a watch list of 0. We rely on the retailer to add the images of the people that make up their watch list, their known criminals and felons. We rely on the casino to add their list of known advantage players or gamblers or dangerous characters. We don't pre-populate anything as part of that watch list goes. And that's actually a super important point to know. And I'm glad you asked the question.
Okay, thank you. I would like to actually, I'm sorry, maybe it's not a question for you, maybe somebody in the crowd that would give me the strongest argument against that kind of bias. If we're biasing against people who are known, or you started from 0, it's even more careful. But if there are known criminals that we know how they look like. So instead of having people searching for them, now we have AI doing that. I would like to hear an argument that would provide an explanation why we shouldn't do that. That would be something. I just don't understand what the problem is.
Yeah, I mean, I get your perspective. I'm not sure if we want to answer that now. I'll defer to Professor Shlomit on that one. Should I continue, or do you want to try to answer that question now?
No, I mean, we'll get answers.
Okay.
But yeah, Danielle.
Hello. I'd like to know how high are the rates of mistakes in identification, and also who takes responsibility? I mean, let's say I'm using OnWatch for my company or whatever, and someone gets arrested because I used OnWatch and there was a mistake in the identification. So who takes responsibility on that? It's
a very good question. So no system is perfect, right? And so we don't position our system as perfect. What we do is we provide, it's effectively kind of confidence intervals. So when we see someone, keep in mind the way that our solution works. The way our solution works is we're embedded effectively within that camera system, whether that be CCTV or whatever cameras they have. And we're literally analyzing frame by frame in real time. And so that means that for a given person, we're not just getting one image of them, we're getting hundreds of images as they pass by the field of view of that camera. We work with our customers to set parameters on false positives and false negatives. And knowing no system is perfect, we work with them to establish those levels where there's some comfort level. So if you want to make sure you always capture the known bad actor, you might set the thresholds quite low. But that also means, and we educate our customers that might mean you're going to catch people that look similar to that person but aren't exact, right? Because we set the threshold low. If you set the threshold higher, you're going to get fewer false positives, but you might let some bad actors in through the cracks. So we educate them on that. So that's part of the answer to your question. The other part of your question is there has to be, this is kind of the human part of it. I've been talking about the algorithmic part of it. The process part of this has to be in place so that, for example, the casino security, when they approach someone that's been flagged, right, they do it in an appropriate way, and they're actually using their own eyes and confirming, in fact, what the algorithms had spotted. So I'm going to talk a little bit later about how not our technology, but how facial recognition technology was used by the Detroit Police Department. And what happened was they literally got a list of 8 or 9 people from the software. Again, it wasn't our software. And based on the highest kind of confidence score, the police went over and arrested the person without doing any due diligence, without doing any investigations. Obviously, we don't support that. That's not how the technology is. So there's a human part of this that has to rely on process and due process. And at the same time, the better solutions are not going to be binary and provide a yes, this is 100% that person, or no, it's not. It's going to be shades of gray, right, with higher levels of confidence. So our technology is really good. I mean, like literally off by 1% in terms of the accuracy level, but it's still off by 1%. So that's why there has to be a human element involved in the process as well.
I just want to get answer to like previous question, and I think better that Dean Nichols will continue, and then we'll keep time at the end. But in general, I think humans are biased, and I think the technology can really improve the biases. Like we have this figure about wrong detection by eyewitnessing, which is more like it's like 70% inaccurate and mismatched by human. So I think that the technology can really improve our safety net in terms of terror and policing. I'm not worried about like biases can be correct, human cannot be tested, machine can be tested. So I'm not worried so much about the accuracy. I think the industry perfect itself, and I think criticism made the industry taking all these precautions and necessary steps to perfect the machine. But I'm really worried about the potential uses of facial recognition against human rights. So it has more to use and less with the accuracy of the machine.
I think there's reasons to be concerned on both sides. I think there's reasons to be concerned by the facial recognition vendors like us. And that's why we need to be a lot more transparent in how we do what we do. And I think there has to be a lot more scrutiny on the people that use our technology and how they're using it and what protocols and processes do they have in place. It has to be balanced, right? And so it's not all or the other. It's kind of a combination. So maybe with that leads into kind of what I think are some of the challenges to having ethical facial recognition. Is it okay if I move forward? Hopefully I can address some of the remaining questions towards the end.
Oh yeah, I know. We'll address more questions and we'll
okay, perfect.
Q&A at the end.
So these are some of the challenges that we face, right? And I'm going to talk about each one of these kind of distinctly. The lack of representative data, the data labels, the experience of the machine learning team, the quality of the images, and operational due diligence. So the first 4 are really about the technology itself, and the last one is about kind of how the technology is being used by the customers. So when we talk about representative data, a lot of people focus on race. They focus on the ethnicities and the skin tones. Do you have enough African-American people, African-American women in your training data sets so that your algorithms work as designed and they can correctly identify African women as well as it can identify old white guys like me, right? However, for us, that's just one of many different potential biases. Like, so if you think about how our technology is used, it's being used within these camera systems for video surveillance. And we also care about what we call facial accessories. Like, so if someone's wearing a mask or glasses, or even if they have a beard, can we recognize that person now with a beard when they didn't have a beard beforehand? And you need to build this kind of data into your training data as well, right? So you eliminate these kinds of biases in addition to demographic bias. For us, seldom do people look directly at the camera in perfect lighting. Like you saw from the previous footage, we're capturing someone in the shade who's looking to the left or to the right, and we're getting a profile view versus someone looking directly at the camera. That's way more difficult from an AI perspective than when you have a perfect image with perfect lighting, right? We also want to make sure that we have different genders and different ages. And so this is where I think a lot of facial recognition technology companies fall down, is that their training data sets don't have enough of this mix in large enough numbers to be truly representative. And so this is something we work really hard to build up our training data sets so they do this. And in case people are asking, well, where are you getting your training data set? Well, thankfully, we can actually use, we do use some consent-based folks who do that, but what we can also do is we can simulate people. Essentially, this is almost like deep fake technology where we can take a single picture of me, for example, and we can apply pigment. And so all of a sudden I become darker skinned, and then we can change my facial so I'm looking left or I'm looking right. And we can use from one picture where we have consent, we can create 20 or 50 different images of that person that helps then feed our algorithms. And so thanks to simulated data, we can actually develop a pretty rigorous data sets to build upon. The other thing that was actually touched on by the previous speaker, and I'm glad she did, is data labeling. Unfortunately, in our space, there are a lot of facial recognition technology companies that actually buy data by essentially third-party data sets of people. And a lot of that data has been tagged with age, gender, et cetera. And a lot of that data has been improperly tagged. And that's where biases actually can enter into the algorithms if that data isn't tagged appropriately. We don't do any of that. We don't buy data from third-party sources, and we do our tagging ourselves. And we start with actual humans that look at these images and then tag the person as being of a certain age, a certain gender, and whether they're posing left or right or looking straight on. In this case, you'll say I have identity. We don't know who this person is, but we might identify them as with a given number so that if we see them a second time or a third time, we know that this is 7586934. And again, we don't really care who the person is. We don't necessarily need to know this is John Smith, out of Brooklyn, New York. What we do care is if we see them on repeated cases, we want to make sure we can identify him, especially if John Smith is in fact on the watch list. The other thing that's I think really important for companies like us that are building facial recognition technology software is that you want to have a really strong AI team. And that means you have to have a really experienced team. You have to have a lot of PhDs, and you need to have folks that are used to building what we call explainable AI, which requires the AI team is well-versed in a lot of the more nuanced areas of artificial intelligence, right? Because what we're doing is quite tricky in terms of the real world conditions where we don't have perfect lighting, we don't have perfect pictures of people looking directly at you, and even the reference data that we have in the database is often less than perfect as well. And the technology is changing all the time. So we need folks that are very well versed in this. And thankfully we have 20 plus PhDs. But this is, when we talk about companies who are vetting facial recognition technology companies, these are some of the questions that they frankly need to be asking is, tell me about your machine learning team. What do they look like? What is their background? How many are there? Where are they located, right? How is your technology built? How are you kind of mitigating against demographic bias? These are, I think, areas that are super important. And so something that we've obviously invested in over the last 5 years is to really build up that team. The other is what I'm calling the quality of the reference data. So again, for us, we don't have an infinite watch list of 10 billion people. In most cases, we have a watch list of 100 people, right, of known kind of bad actors. And oftentimes the pictures that we're given that make up watch list are not ideal. So you'll see, for example, pictures on the right are the pictures that we have, that we might upload from maybe public mugshots of known felons. But when we see them coming through the cameras, you'll see that sometimes they have a mustache, sometimes they're looking down and away. And so this is really the tricky part of what we do, is trying to match those people up. Because obviously some of these images, like whether being included or hidden by other people, a very technical problem to find that person in the whole sea of other people that are coming across a camera. And so this is oftentimes where we actually encourage our customers to upload 1 or 2 or 3 images of a person on a watch list with different views, because the more images that we have, if they're high quality, it's going to help us identify those people in real time, when they enter a building or facility. This was the example I pointed to before, and this is kind of the human element, right? And this is the example of the Detroit Police Department. This was a special done by Anderson Cooper in 60 Minutes a few months back. And I thought this quote was really interesting. And again, this comes from the Detroit's chief of police, and they're using facial recognition software to help them effectively help solve crimes after the fact. And he's talking in this case about a guy that was arrested wrongfully. He says, "This old driver's license photo of Robert Williams popped up. We learned it was ranked 9th among 243 possible matches. An analyst then sent it to Detroit police as an investigative lead only, not probable cause to arrest. But they went ahead and arrested this guy anyways." And he goes on to say, "But it wasn't facial recognition that failed. What failed was a horrible investigation," right? So as much as we're focusing on the technology and the AI, it's just as important to focus on how is the technology being used and what due processes are in place to ensure positive outcomes, right? This was less than a positive outcome. So we spend a lot of time with our customers helping them understand this is how you interpret the data that we provide you. We're not providing you, this is a 100% guarantee that this is that person. This is a high probability that this is that person. And we're allowing you to do that without having to watch, maybe 20 different CCTV cameras all at once, right? It's just adding a little more science to the problem, but you still need to have the human element on what is the appropriate way to approach those individuals that seem to be a high fit, high correlation that they are the person on the watch list. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk a little bit about is the 7 ingredients. So what are the things that we've built into our solution to help make it a more ethical facial recognition solution? Well, I've hinted at the first one, which is diverse data, right? So again, it's not just demographic diversity, it's based on the poses, it's based on the ages, the genders. And so we've built that into our algorithms. What's also, I think, very important when it comes to facial recognition is the security of the data. How is that data actually being captured, and is it being encrypted, and where is that data going to? So for example, with our solutions, the data stays on premise. It stays on the servers within the casino or within the school or within the building. It doesn't come to us, right? So we don't, at Usto, don't have access to that data. It's all sitting on premise and it's all encrypted in transit. And that's super important for protecting all of our privacy. Was the algorithms created with the real world conditions in mind? If all of your algorithms were created with perfect lighting conditions and where people are looking directly at the camera, it's not going to perform great, in crowded situations or situations where there's poor lighting or a lot of shade. How was the watch list created? Was the watch list created with 100 people, or was it scraped off of Google, LinkedIn, and forms a database of 10 billion images, right? So it's understanding that. We also offer a couple of different privacy modes. So that means one privacy mode says on video playback, we will literally blur everyone else in the frame except for the person on the watch list. And this is to help protect the identities of the innocent people that are not on the watch list. And we have another mode that can literally delete all detections that are not related to the actual person on the watch list. These are some of the safeguards I think that are really imperative for companies like us to build into their system. Now, keep in mind that our commercial customers, the stadiums, the schools, the office parks, they still have the security footage. So they have the video footage that's not blurred. So if they ever need to kind of look at the raw footage, they have that. But we do offer that ability to help protect the identities of the innocents, at least with our solution. We talked a little bit about user consent. We think this is super important for our commercial customers to let people know through conspicuous signage that they use facial recognition, but they use it to help protect their space. They use it to protect their people. They use it to protect their profits, right? So I think helping people understand that we're not tracking you across, Macy's is important. Like, we're really only trying to find the people that are on the naughty list. And then lastly, I've mentioned terms of service. So we, within our own contracts, with our commercial customers, we have an out clause that says if you're going to use any of our technology for what we deem as being unethical, and we literally have a board of ethics at Usto, then we will not sell you our technology. We will turn it off. And this actually happened within the last 2 months, where we had a customer who wanted to use our technology to effectively spy in the lunchroom for anyone that might be organizing for a union. And they wanted to identify who those people are. And we said, sorry, we don't work for those use cases, right? You can get someone else's technology, right? But that's, I think, an important area that we don't often talk about, but I think companies like us need to draw the line in the sand. I want to talk a little bit about the role of regulation. This is very different than the previous speaker, who went much more in depth than I'm going to go. I'm going to present where I think regulation, could and should go in the future. And it really starts with, how is the watch list created? So there hasn't been a lot of regulation around this. So when I talked about Clearview scraping the images, our images of our faces off of LinkedIn and Google, I think there needs to be some government oversight to find out, is that in fact in the public domain? If I load a picture to Facebook, is that picture in the public domain or not? And right now there's been very murkiness when it comes to what, if in fact that's in the public domain. And that's what's allowed Clearview to scrape all of those images. Another area, again, which we welcome, is how are the algorithms created, right? What is the process? Can we have some transparency around how the algorithms were built? What kind of training data was used? How are you ensuring that you're trying to mitigate against demographic, racial, and other types of biases? How is consent being captured? And then lastly, how is that technology being operationalized? So if you think back to the Detroit Police Department, what processes is being used to make sure that there's actually a sound and ethical investigation that goes along with the facial recognition to ensure that the people that are being approached, that are being arrested, were in fact potential suspects, and they were anywhere near the crime scene at the time that it happened, right? There was some due diligence that was being applied to that. So these are 4 areas that I think regulations can go into, where right now there are frankly none, or very little. Maybe I'll stop right now and ask maybe Professor Ravid if there's anything you want to talk about on this slide, because I know this is something you and I had talked about one-on-one.
Yeah, I think the most surprising issue is that the industry really and really struggle for regulation. And so I wonder, first, thank you. It was fascinating and so interesting to hear the voice of the industry. And I think super important for promoting discourse. And I think that's what we are envisioning in this ethical, legal AI exchange forum. But I would like to ask, so when listening to you, so I realized that in the major part, you already adapt our conclusion of self-compliance and self-guideline. If you do you agree with me?
I'm not sure if I understood the question. Could you say it one more time?
So Professor Basri spoke about compliance guideline that should be adopted by the AI industry. So listening to you, so I figured out that you already kind of adopting few of the things of this recommendation by adopting self-compliance, self-guidelines, self-regulation policy before.
Yeah, I think we're fully on board. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to hear all of her presentation, but for the most part, we're fully embracing of regulations, which might be surprising for the people in your audience to hear that. But the feeling is we're doing it the right way. And by the way, none of us at Usto want to live in a police state. None of us want to live in a world where we're being tracked the moment we get off a plane in Beijing, and if we cross a crosswalk or jaywalk, our facial image and our name and minus 20 social credits kind of happen. That's not the world we want, right? So we're all about designing a system that really makes places more safe, makes people more safe. And we're essentially automating what right now is a very clunky and frankly, a very bias-ridden system where you're having security people having to memorize faces of people, which is just frankly nonsensical in this day and age. And it's also way more prone to bias than using automation and AI.
Can the industry secure, like, anonymize the data? Like, because like there is one thing is like collecting the data and perfecting the industry and like making sure that the identification will be much more accurate than human identification and human biases. But on the other hand, how can we prevent the government and others to use these, identities, our identity, our recognition, our facial recognition against our benefit?
Yeah, I mean, we don't work with governments, right? So we work with sometimes we work with government agencies. So like in some cases we'll work with essentially the TSA equivalent in Tel Aviv, like at the airports, to identify people on the watch list. But I think what we're trying to do collectively, and this session is kind of part of that, is to educate people that there's a broad continuum when it comes to facial recognition. And there's a right way to do this and there's a wrong way to do this. And so starting with a watch list that is narrowly defined based on security threats, I think is a good starting point. I think having some transparency about how the algorithms were developed, and even having a watchdog, whether it's NIST, that comes in and essentially vets a technology as being kind of ethical, I think that's where we need to go. And so it's going to, these technologies are these standards aren't going to be adopted by China probably anytime soon. But in other parts of the Western world, we should kind of demand that these safeguards are built and that are in place, and that we have that level of transparency.
Yeah, I mean, it's so important what you're sharing with us. Any other questions from the participants?
I had a couple more slides, but again, this is not meant to be a commercial, but I did want to just, maybe I'll skip through a couple of these. Let me share my screen again.
And Daniel, you wanted like, you had like the second half of your question that was cut by us. So
Yes.
you're welcome to share that. I'm sorry for.
I just think that the main concern of people about facial recognition is they don't want to be on any watch list by mistake. And I don't know about your company, but can all the companies guarantee that? I mean, people just don't want to be there. They're afraid to be identified mistakenly, or I don't know what are they afraid of. So can anyone assure that?
That I think is it's a great question, and the answer right now is no. I don't think we can't, because we're not creating the watch list for our customers. They're creating their own watch list, right? And so if you go into MGM Grand, like we don't provide that watch list for them. They're creating their own watch list. And so what you're asking for is, how can we have some transparency with the companies that are using the technology? And so, and that's kind of difficult, right? I mean, I honestly don't know how that problem is going to get solved. I think it's a great question, and it's an area where it'd be great to have some regulation around it. I don't know how you would enforce it, but I think it's somewhat needed.
Thank you.
Okay, I just have a few more slides here, and this is let me share my screen again. This is kind of the about Usto portion, but I'm not going to let me go full screen really quickly here. Bear with me here. I think there's a few more questions, but let me just go through. So this is, again, that is the commercial part of it. We have lots of, we have 500 plus customers. We have lots of tier 1 customers around the world, 20 plus PhDs. These are some of the things that we built into our product, from the custom watch list to the face blur, to what we call privacy mode, which I talked about, data encryption, demographic bias, and even granular permissions, like who can actually access the data from our customer's side. The other thing is we have set out 6 principles for ourselves, and I think every company in our space should have a similar kind of set of guiding principles. And so our guiding principles are around fairness, transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, notice and consent, and lawful surveillance. And so we generally try to live by these principles. I think we do live by these principles. And you'd find these on our website, but I think any company worth their salt not only has these principles, but literally has the actions and the processes behind that can show you, here's how we address non-discrimination. Here's how we address accountability. Here's how we address notice and consent, right? So they're not just words. There's actually processes in place that back it up. And so actually with that, maybe I'll stop sharing and open up to any final questions.
Yeah, I wonder, any other questions? Do you post your, the rules that you were sharing with us?
I'm sorry, so you want me to post the slides or?
No, I mean, do you post like not the slide, but I mean, all these rules of transparency or like the testing of.
Yeah,
so,
this is on our, we have a whole section on our website that says, why trust us? And you'll find this in there. The other thing that we've done is we just recently written an ebook called The Rise of Ethical Facial Recognition that goes into what I talked about in a lot more depth, right? And we're very transparent about like, this is how we build our algorithms. This is the processes and controls that we put in place. This is how we encrypt data. And so we've been pretty loud, outspoken vendors in the space, and we've been actually very outspoken critics of Clearview as well. And so honestly, if you typed in Google ethical facial recognition and you clicked on the news tab, I think you'd find us all over the place because we're trying to get the word out. We're trying to help educate media, the regulators, the consumers, everyday consumers, as well as businesses, is like you need to be asking the right questions before you deploy any kind of technology like this. And we are trying to set the bar pretty high when it comes to ethical facial recognition and defining even what the ingredients are. So yeah, I think we've been pretty outspoken on this whole topic.
I see. All right, so I say, okay, so we'll end up with that, unless you want to say something as a concluding statement.
I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to speak, to this group. And I think the more conversations we can have like this that are rational, where we can talk about the pros and cons of facial recognition, we can understand what are the limitations and what are some of the safeguards we can build in so that we don't move to the red zone, right? I think that's where we need to do. This is a pretty complicated field. It's pretty nuanced, right? And there's not, despite what you might read in the media, it's not black and white, right? And I think these are the kind of dialogues we need just to have a lot more of, right? So people feel more comfortable with the technology, or they understand the limitations of the technology, and they start demanding more from regulators. They start demanding more from companies like us.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for participating, for spending these few hours with us. I think it's really challenging. We're just, I think that our journey has just started, and I think that this is a really complex issue. There are a lot of concerns, there are a lot of answers, there are a lot of lack of, like a lot of uncertainty and lack of information and lack of regulation. So we would love to cover a lot of things. Maybe we won't save the world, but we'll take some step forward, like perfecting this dialogue and bridging the gap between the industry and policymakers. So thank you, everyone, the participants. Thank you, Professor Basri. Thank you, Dean Nichols from USTO, and all the others who helped me getting this international workshop together. We had almost 90 participants, so I think it's really impressive. So thank you all for staying. I know there are people from Europe and the US and Israel and many other places all around the globe. And I really appreciate all this interest that you show and your active participations. And with that, we'll end. All right, let's stop the recording.